To mark the start of this auspicious event, upholding the tradition and values.
जयति जय जय जयति जय जय ज्ञान का आलोक अनुपम श्रेष्ठ सुंदर दिव्य दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय विहंगम जयति जय जय जयति जय जय ज्ञान का आलोक अनुपम सकल वसुधा निज कुटुंब की भावना संस्कृति सनातन आधुनिक शिक्षा पुरातन ज्ञान धाराओं का संगम देश की स्वाधीनता हित भूमिका शत कोटि वंदन निष्ठा सत्यम के मंगल दिव्य भावों का समागम जयति जय जय जयति जय जय ज्ञान का आलोक अनुपम भव्य महाविद्यालयों के परिसरों से चिर सुशोभित श्रेष्ठ गुरुजन कर रहे नित्य छात्र और छात्राएं दीक्षित सदचरित्राचार पावन साधना संकल्प संयम नमन वर्षित चेतना नव क्रांति संस्कारों का उद्गम जयति जय जय जयति जय जय ज्ञान का आलोक अनुपम श्रेष्ठ सुंदर दिव्य दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय विहंगम जयति जय जय जयति जय जय ज्ञान का आलोक अनुपम ज्ञान का आलोक अनुपम ज्ञान का आलोक अनुपम ज्ञान का आलोक अनुपम
Thank you. That was truly a wonderful start to the event. Before we delve deeper into the heart of our theme, it is my privilege to invite Professor Ananya Ghosh Daskirar Ma'am, the head of department, to share a few words of wisdom with us.
Very good morning to everyone. It's my privilege to welcome all our guests, our faculty members and dear students to this program which celebrates, among other things, 50 years of the Business Economics program. And it's indeed an honor to have with us two of the founding members of our department, Professor Lalan Prasad, Professor K.R.G. Nair, who have given shape to this program which stands where it does today. Thank you very much, sir, for coming. Well, I would like to extend a very, very warm welcome to our guest of honor, Shri Sanjeev Sanyal, and thank deeply Professor Shri Singh for taking out time to be with us at this function today, despite today being the standing committee meeting which is being held at the university. Thank you, sir, for finding time for us. With this, I'm just going to welcome everybody once again to this national seminar and hope it's going to be a day of learning and a day which gives us the inspiration to cover 50 more years so that we can, while India celebrates its Amrit Kal, also celebrate 75 years of the Business Economics program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your gracious thoughts. Moving forward, the theme for today's event is India's growth trajectory during the Amrit Kal, charting India's Amrit Kal journey, growth, sustainability and prosperity. Amrit Kal is a term that translates to the era of nectar or golden age in English. It is often used metaphorically to describe a period of exceptional growth, prosperity, and positive transformation. During the Amrit Kal, India experienced robust economic growth, witnessing a surge in GDP, industrial development, and technological advancements. In essence, the theme celebrates a transformative era in India's history. To enlighten us more about the theme, we have with us today our session chair, Professor Shri Singh. Mr. Singh is a luminary in the realm of political science and is currently the director of South Campus at the University of Delhi and a renowned professor in the Department of Political Science. With a career spanning several decades, Professor Singh held various pivotal positions, including being a chair professor at the Indian Institute of Public Administration and an associate professor at Shri College. His involvement with committees and boards such as the Academic Audit Committee of MHRD, UGC and NAAC showcases his commitment to ensuring academic excellence and standards in higher education. In conclusion, Professor Singh stands as a paragon of scholarly achievement and social commitment. We are indeed privileged to have him as our session chair. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Mr. Singh. I would like to request you to please join us on stage. It is with great honor and enthusiasm that I stand before you today to welcome our esteemed chief guest, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, to our conference. As the principal economic advisor to the Government of India, he plays a pivotal role in shaping the economic landscape of a nation that stands at the forefront of global progress. A luminary in the financial sector, his two-decade journey is a testament to his profound understanding of the intricacies of the global economy. Beyond the boardrooms and financial markets, Mrs. Sanyal has emerged as a distinguished author with best-selling works such as Land of the Seven Rivers, The Indian Renaissance, and The Ocean of Churn. As we welcome Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal to this conference, let us embrace the wealth of knowledge and experience he brings with him. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Mr. Sanyal. I would like to request you, sir, to please join us on stage. I also would like to request the head of our department, Professor Ananya Ghosh Taskidar ma'am, to join us on stage. Now, without further ado, I invite Professor Prakash Singh sir to address the audience.
Thank you so much. Good morning. कुछ तो दिक्कत रहती है और दिल्ली के अभी के मौसम में ज्यादा गर्मी है। Department of Finance and Business Economics, University of Delhi South Campus. Professor ललन प्रसाद जी, आपको बहुत समय के बाद देख रहा हूँ, बहुत बहुत स्वागत है आपका अपने ही कैंपस में। प्रोफेसर पीजी नायर साहब, प्रोफेसर अनन्या दस्तीदार, डॉक्टर चंद्रमोहन नेगी, प्रोफेसर अमित वर्धन, प्रोफेसर खासा, प्रोफेसर मनीष और आज के कार्यक्रम के गेस्ट ऑफ ऑनर की नोट एड्रेस के लिए उपस्थित श्री संजीव सान्याल जी। मेरी स्टैंडिंग कमेटी थी तो मैं तो सान्याल जी से मिलने और सुनने आया हूं। आज का जो विषय आप लोगों ने तय किया है, 75 years of Indian economy, वे फॉरवर्ड इन अमृतकाल, इस विषय पर संजीव जी से बेहतर कोई वक्ता हो नहीं सकता। वक्ता के चयन के लिए हेड साहिबा और पूरे विभाग को बहुत बहुत बधाई। लेकिन जब हम 75 years की बात करते हैं तो many a times, being a student of social sciences, I am reminded about our rich legacy. For what these people, Portuguese, Dutches, Britishers, Franceses, came to India? They all came to India for trading purposes. Definitely there was something else beyond it, but basic purpose was at that point of time the trade. और ट्रेड कभी किसी गरीब राष्ट्र के साथ नहीं होता है, हमेशा मजबूत और समृद्ध राष्ट्र के साथ होता है। तो हजारों हजारों साल की विरासत हमारी थी। तमाम इकोनॉमिस्ट, चाहे वो उत्सव पटनायक हो, चाहे एंगल्स मेडिसिन हो, चाहे हमारे अभी जो फॉरेन मिनिस्टर हैं जयशंकर साहब, उनकी किताब आप पढ़ें तो हमें तमाम ऐसे स्रोत मिलते हैं कि हमारी कितनी रिच लेगेसी थी और हमारा नेशन, हमारा राष्ट्र कितना रिच था। लेकिन उस जर्नी में, उस यात्रा में 75 years आफ्टर इंडिपेंडेंस बहुत महत्वपूर्ण हो जाते हैं, क्योंकि जितना एक्सप्लॉयटेशन हमारा ब्रिटिशर्स कर सकते थे उन्होंने किया, और जब कुछ बचा नहीं तो उन्होंने बांटो और भाग चलो की नीति का अनुसरण कर लिया। उन्होंने हमको बांटा और यहां से चलते बने। और उसके बाद की जो यात्रा है भारत की संघर्षों के साथ, वो बहुत सुखद यात्रा है। और आज प्रधानमंत्री मोदी जी के नेतृत्व में जिस तरह से हमारी इकोनॉमी की ग्रोथ हुई है, जिस तरह से तमाम अंतर्राष्ट्रीय एजेंसीज अपनी रेटिंग्स में भारत के लिए एक सुनहरा कल दिखा रही हैं, उन सब पर प्रकाश डालने के लिए मुझे लगता है कि संजीव सान्याल जी से बेहतर कोई व्यक्ति हो नहीं सकता। जब आप उनको सुनेंगे, उनका एक परिचय और है जो मैं आप सबसे साझा करना चाहता हूं, खास करके युवाओं से साझा करना चाहता हूं। आप सबने गूगल जरूर किया होगा थोड़ा बहुत, लेकिन हिंदुस्तान का जो रिवोल्यूशनरी मूवमेंट है, भारत की आजादी का जो क्रांतिकारी आंदोलन है, उसमें एक नाम स्वर्णाक्षरों में लिखा हुआ है, वो नाम है सचिंद्र सान्याल का। आप उस परिवार से हैं, आप उनके पोते लगते हैं, तो मैं चाहता हूं सचिंद्र नाथ सान्याल जी के लिए एक बार हम सबकी करतल ध्वनि अवश्य हो जाए। Why I'm referring Sachin Sanyal, that chapter is very close to me. I teach political science, I study that part with lots of devotion and commitment. मेरी कमजोरी भी है, मैं उस पर लंबा बोल सकता हूं, बोलूंगा नहीं। जब चंद्रशेखर आजाद को प्रयागराज में बरी किया गया, उन्हें जलाया गया, आग दी गई, तो आपकी दादी सचिन नाथ सान्याल जी की पत्नी वहां पर आई थी। और उन्होंने एक प्रकरण सुनाया कि किस तरह से बंगाल में क्रांतिकारियों को सम्मान दिया गया है, किस तरह से उनको सम्मानित करती रही है जनता। और उस प्रकरण को सुनने के बाद चंद्रशेखर आजाद की राख, जो चिता की राख थी, उसको तमाम लोग मुट्ठी में, कागज में, जो जिसके पास था उसको बांध करके घर ले गए। और उनके परिवार को एक स्थिति में कहना पड़ा, कुछ तो छोड़ दो जिसे हम गंगा में प्रवाहित कर सकें। तो लुक एट द इम्पैक्ट, look at the impact of the name sacrifice, what they did for our nation. और कितना कमिटमेंट, कितना, आज की तरह ना तो मोबाइल फोन थे ना व्हाट्सएप था, सिर्फ एक वर्नाकुलर प्रेस के माध्यम से बहुत सारी चीजें वहां पहुंचती थी। तो आप सबसे एक तो मेरा आग्रह है, जब भी अवसर मिले उस स्वतंत्रता के आंदोलन के उस कालखंड को जरूर पढ़ें। मनमथनाथ गुप्त की राइटिंग्स नहीं होती तो बहुत कुछ पता नहीं लगता। अगर मैं गलत नहीं हूं तो सन्याल साहब की 11 किताबें हैं उस फेज की। हाँ, है ना। तो आप ये समझ लीजिए कि अगर वो सब हम सबके सामने आ रहा है तो इस युवा पीढ़ी की जिम्मेदारी बनती है कि हम उसको जरूर पढ़ें, उसको जानें कि हमारे पूर्वजों ने हमारे लिए क्या क्या सेक्रीफाइसेस किए हैं। और ये आज़ादी हमें बहुत आसानी से नहीं मिली। अब आप सोच रहे होंगे इकोनॉमिक्स का लेक्चर है, आज़ादी की बात कर रहा हूं। ये आज़ादी हमें औपनिवेशिकता की तरफ ले जा सकती है अगर हम चैतन्य नहीं रहते हैं, होशियार नहीं रहते हैं, या राष्ट्र के प्रति समर्पित नहीं रहते हैं। हजारों हजार साल पहले हमारी जो विरासत है वो बताती है हम बहुत समृद्ध थे। सोने की चिड़िया हमको ऐसे नहीं कहा जाता था, सच में समृद्ध थे। इसी नाते लोग हमसे व्यापार करने आते थे। और व्यापार में क्या क्या आप सबने प्राइमरी से लेकर के 11वीं 12वीं तक पढ़ा ही होगा, क्या क्या आदान प्रदान होता था। फिर से हम समृद्धि की तरफ चल रहे हैं। और जब आप समृद्ध होते हैं तो खतरे बढ़ते चले जाते हैं। तो आप सभी भारत के भविष्य हैं, देश का भविष्य आपके कंधों पर है। और इससे बढ़िया विद्यार्थी समूह मुझे तो नहीं लगता कहीं और मिलता होगा। सचिन, आप सोच करके देखें, दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय, उसमें एमबीए के स्टूडेंट्स, एमएफसी के स्टूडेंट्स जो अपने आप में बहुत सारे कॉम्पिटिशन्स को क्लियर करके यहाँ पहुँचते हैं, तो आपका दायित्व तो और बड़ा हो जाता है। बहुत ज़्यादा न कहते हुए, अभी दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय ने अपने 100 साल पूरे किए हैं, आप अपने 50 साल पूरे कर रहे हैं। आप सभी को बहुत बहुत बधाई। और जैसे मैंने पहले कहा था कि मैं भी संजीव जी को सुनने आया था, तो मैं उसी लिए अपना स्थान ग्रहण करता हूँ। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Thank you so much, sir. It was a pleasure to hear your views. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, sir, to share his thoughts with us.
Professor Singh, Professor Dastidar, faculty and students of the Department of Business Economics of the Delhi University. Just wait a second while I get the, you can give it to me. It might be easier for everybody to see them. So, ladies and gentlemen, the topic that I'm going to talk about is actually derives directly from what Professor Singh was telling us, which is that it is about taking control of the India narrative. And as you will see very quickly why this is an important thing to do, if we want to see ourselves as a global economic and geopolitical power. If we want to do that, we need to control our own narrative. Now, as many of you already know, India is already the world's 5th largest economy in dollar terms. In purchasing power terms, we already are the world's 3rd largest economy. Within the next 18 months, we will probably go past Germany, and by 26, 27 or thereabouts, we will go past Japan to become the world's 3rd largest economy. Now, this means, ironically, that we will be challenging a certain global architecture. After many centuries, we will emerge as a serious global power. As you can imagine, this means that we will be upsetting many arrangements which have lasted for quite some time. And we are doing it at a time when China has already upended it in multiple ways. So not surprisingly, there will be a lot of pressure on us. There will be many attempts to try and waylay us, take control of us, of our minds in various ways. And so it is important that your generation, the generation that is there in the students today, understand how this game is played. My generation will do it to the extent we can, but you should understand what is going on and how this game is played. So, since this conference is about Amrit Kaal, let me say that in order to take advantage of the 25 years, we need to take control of our own narrative. So let me begin with my first slide. Both these are probably familiar to you from newspaper headlines. One of them tells you that India is pretty much towards the bottom. It's 111 out of 125 countries on the Global Hunger Index. And at the same time, the global press tells us that India is an obesity time bomb. Like something like 25% of the population is obese. Now think about the sheer absurdity of this statement. Now, I'm not making the case that you can't have nutrition problems if you're obese. Of course, if you're eating badly, you can be. But remember, hunger is a peculiar and specific kind of malnourishment. It really relates to not being able to eat enough, i.e. a calorific deficiency. And yet, the global narrative tells us that we are both hungry and obese. Now, where does this conversation come from? Who wants to tell this story? What is the justification of these stories? So, I'm going to get into how this came about that we were considered hungry and obese at the same time. So before we go there, I want to tell you a little bit about why global indices matter. You'll see some of these indices have existed for quite some time. But you may have noticed, even in the time you've been in university, when most of you are postgraduate, so you have at least been around, you are probably at least in your early 20s. In which case, even you are old enough to notice that there has been a sudden proliferation of a large number of these indices. Some of them exist for a while, but there seems to be one of these every week. So what is going on here? What is going on here is that there is now a big effort to create these indices at a global scale. Almost all of them exclusively from the North Atlantic. Now, our typical historical approach to dealing with this, even earlier when there were fewer of these indices, was effectively to say that we should just ignore them. Who cares? It's just an opinion of somebody. But in fact, they have a real impact on your lives. You all know about sovereign ratings. Yeah? Every country has a sovereign rating. That has an impact on our life because that in many ways impacts the cost of capital, not just for the government, but for all the companies from that country. And it will come as some surprise to you that many of these indices, which are then amalgamated into something called the World Bank's World Governance Indicator, accounts for something like 18 to 20% of the weightage of your sovereign rating. So we can't ignore them. More importantly, there has been now a proliferation in the last few years of something called ESG. How many of you are familiar with what ESG is? Good, at least quite a few of you do. It relates to environmental, social and governance indicators. Now all of a sudden, in the last few years, we have suddenly found that these things are being used for investment decisions, for FTAs, the free trade agreements. The European Union earlier this year mandated that this has to be part of all kinds of corporate reporting. I've given here an example here of the JP Morgan Asset Management Sovereign Rating ESG Scoring Framework. Remember, this is an agency that allocates hundreds of millions of dollars around the world, and they too use an ESG framework. And in all of these global indices end up playing a role. So, we cannot afford to not engage with them. So we have to pay attention to what these indices are saying. And if they are saying something quite odd about India on a systematic basis, as I will show you, then we need to finally begin to dig through their methodology. This is important because you see, it's all very good to say it, saying no, it doesn't make sense. How can India be at 111 out of 125 countries on the hunger index when we are actually exporting food to countries and in fact sending food aid to countries that are further up the hunger index list? So, we cannot ignore them. So let me start one by one. I'm going to start with something called the VDEM. VDEM is a think tank in Sweden called Varieties of Democracy Institute. And VDEM is very, very influential. It's been around for decades. VDEM's Liberal Democracy Index, which comes out every year, gives a rating in which India is considered the 97 in the Liberal Democracy Index. Now just imagine, the world's largest democracy is ranked 97. Now if you think that okay, maybe that we are really bad, then let's have a look at who are the countries ranked above us. It turns out that number 1 is Kingdom of Denmark, number 2 is Kingdom of Sweden, number 3 is Kingdom of Norway. The main finding from this democracy index is that being a kingdom is good for democracy. Not just that, it goes on like this. In fact, I have got, many of these countries are democratic. New Zealand is also a kingdom. And then look at some of the people who are above us in the list. There is Kingdom of Lesotho, which had a military coup as recently as 2014. It then was put under emergency as recently as 2020 and again in 2022. It is ranked 64. We are ranked 97. Kosovo, which is not even a proper country, it was declared independence from Serbia only in 2008, and there's lots of disputed areas, as you know. Even that is ranked number 70. Timor-Leste, which officially became a country in 2002. So these are the countries that are above us. So the question is, how did we turn up with this? Well, if you go through their reports, VDEM, by the way, reported that India was actually an electoral autocracy. Now what on earth does that mean? They're not disputing that we have elections. They're just making the point that somehow we are an electoral autocracy. So when was the last time that we were an electoral autocracy according to the VDEM? Well, it turns out that we were an electoral autocracy last time in 1975-76, which was during the period of the emergency. I don't think even the biggest critics of the current government will argue that human rights, democratic rights today are under the same kind of threat as they were during the period of emergency. If they think so, they seriously need to go back and read their history. And yet, this is what VDEM thinks about what is going on right now. So how did this decline in our democracy happen? Not surprisingly, it turns out that it is very closely linked to the 2014 election. We all know what happened in the 2014 election, and according to VDEM, everything went wrong after that. Now, I find it very difficult to believe that it didn't have some sort of a ideological tinge to this line of thinking. Now, how is this democracy index calculated? Well, it turns out it has two components. One is the factual component, which is basically type of election, minimum voting age, percentage of population with suffrage, etc. These are all objective indicators. And then it includes the opinions of a tiny number of experts. We are never told who those experts are, how many there are, but per country they are somewhere between 3 to 5 in most of these, even if some of them have no more than 20. I'm not talking only of VDEM, I'm talking about all these indices that I'm going to talk about. Now, even in your class election, if I wanted to do an opinion poll, I would probably need to survey more than 3 to 5 people. Now, these people are ranking the whole world based on these kinds of surveys. And as you can see, there is the yellow line, that is the line for all the objective indices. None of them have changed. They are the same. In fact, we score very well. We score 100%, 1. But it is on all the opinions of the experts, as I said, whose names we are not ever told, and whose numbers also we are not told, but we know unofficially that they tend to be a very small number. That is where the numbers have begun to decline. But this is not just happening with this. If you take VDEM's Academic Freedom Index, here is the Academic Freedom Index of 2022. It turns out that their opinion, India's ranking is not only in the bottom 10 to 20%, it is far below Afghanistan. Now, after they were greatly mocked on social media, the following year, that's 2023, this year, they moved Afghanistan's ranking below ours and claimed that last year there had been a computer error. But we are below all kinds of countries, Russia, we are below, Libya, and so on and so forth. Evidently, I'm sorry to tell you, young students, your academic freedom is really at the bottom of the range. So every time your faculty scold you and argue with you, please quote this back to them that you're endangering their academic freedom. Then you have the Press Freedom Index. This is by another agency called Reporters Sans Frontières, or Reporters Without Borders. And in that, you can see the India report mentions that the situation has gone from problematic to very bad. So where are we placed? We are again in this placed below Sudan, Afghanistan, Palestine, Somalia, Hong Kong. You got to be kidding me. The point I'm trying to demonstrate to you that there isn't even a pretense of trying to be objective. The index number 4. This is from another think tank called Freedom House based in the US, and it declared that India is not only is it partially free as of 2021, and by the way, this is an institution that does not consider Kashmir to be a part of India, so that you know. Now this institution has, of course, they don't rank but they give a score, and you can see we were given a score of 66. And that score has again been going down since 2018 or thereabouts. But again, you can see our score is below the likes of Lesotho, Timor-Leste and so on, which I mentioned to you were, well, strange countries to put above us. But it's even below North Cyprus. Now, in case you don't know anything about North Cyprus, let me tell you, it is a part of Cyprus Island that was invaded and occupied by the Turks in the 1970s. It is not recognized even by the United Nations, and its basis of its existence today is the ethnic cleansing of its entire Greek separate population. So a place that is not recognized by the UN has ethnically cleansed its Greek population, but of course is a wonderful democracy as per Freedom House. Now, there are a common set of issues with all these perception-based indices. Now, these are not, notice, indices that are based on any hard data. They are based just on opinions of people. And there's a common thread. One is, of course, they are the opinions of a tiny number of unknown experts. I would very strongly urge that you can set up in this Department of Business Economics your own committee of experts, divide up your students, and come up with an index. Who knows, maybe it will be a better one. Because they are all unknown experts. Who knows who these people are? So you should also do one like this. There is hardly any transparency, how they are chosen, what is their expertise, nothing is known about these people. We managed to get hold of their questionnaire, and it's full of very, very subjective questions. For example, there is the Economic Intelligence Unit, which has questions like, how pervasive is corruption? Now it's a completely open-ended question. Different people will have different perceptions. They have a scoring chart. Even within a country, different people will score it completely different because there is no objective way of answering this question. And just imagine they're ranking countries across countries based on a question like how pervasive is corruption. Then there are questions that are not clear indicators of democracy at all. For example, Sweden has a question which says to what extent is direct popular vote utilized? Now, direct popular vote is basically a referendum. Now, you can do it in a very small country. Now, how on earth are you going to do referendums in a country of our size? This may work in Switzerland or Luxembourg or some such place. And it's not even clear that it leads to very good outcomes, as the British have discovered, but that's a different matter. But you see, these are all skewed questions meant for a particular context, and they are deliberately utilized in which, by the way, in this particular category, to what extent is direct popular vote utilized, we get a score of 0. Because of course, we are completely incapable of carrying out a nationwide referendum. So the fact that we are democracy and that we have a parliament and these issues are discussed in parliament counts for nothing for this category. And of course, a lot of selective media reports are used to justify many of these things. Now, I wrote a bunch of papers, some of you may have read them, and they are available on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council website, basically questioning many of these methodologies. So I've discovered that almost nobody had questioned their methodologies for all these decades. So I took these methodologies out and began going into their methodology and questioning them line by line. What is the methodology? Why do you have this weight? Why do you ask these questions? So as a result of which there has been a little bit of pushback. I wrote about it in the newspapers, others also picked it up and so on. Some of you may also have seen social media discussion on it. So as a result of which, finally, some journalist somewhere questioned the director of VDEM Institute in Sweden about their methodology, and that there was this somewhat cranky economist in India who was asking all them about their methodology. So their response in this interview, which you can all read online because it's a public interview in the press, and it was hilarious. They did not answer any of the questions that I raised about methodology, how they take opinions, etc. Their main argument was that their results must be true because they used high maths. For some reason they thought that Indians would get scared when told about maths. And then they said they were coming to these results because of supercomputers. You've got to be kidding me. These are opinions of a few dozen people. Why do you need a supercomputer to compute all of this? You don't even need an Excel sheet. You can do it manually. Right? And yet they are evidently using supercomputers to do all of this. Again, they have thought that telling Indians about computers was going to scare them. And here is their actual, I'm going to quote their actual response. We use supercomputers. It is almost like asking astronomers, how do you do your calculations? In other words, we should ask them this question. The code for this is also open for anyone to see. It isn't. But it is complicated. If you have half a year, we can teach you about it. We are not astronomers, but we are the astronomers of social science. Really? Collating opinions of a few so-called experts is rocket science and astronomy? And that evidently takes half a year to learn this? I think we should ask them for one class in your department. Should be more than good enough. And if you don't believe me, read my papers. It will take you maybe half an hour to read it. All of you will understand. However, this does not only end with perception-based indices. Even when you are using so-called hard data, these kinds of problems also persist. So let me show you how it works. Now you will think that, okay, let's ignore opinion-based indices. Let's look at hard data indices. So here, let me show you what happens even in hard data. You may all know about the Human Development Indicator. After GDP, it is the second most used indicator of economic progress. One of its most important components, by the way, is life expectancy at birth. It is the number of years that somebody born right now can be reasonably expected to live. Yeah, life expectancy at birth. Most of you are from economics, you'll understand what this means. Now, it turns out that the population prospects and also WHO dramatically lowered our life expectancy in 2022, but for the year 2021, they dramatically lowered it. And the reason they justified is because of the COVID shock. Now, I want to point out that we were the second largest reduction in life expectancy of any country in the world as a result of this. And so our HDI and others also got influenced. So suddenly, we went from the average Indian expected to live to 70.8 years at birth to 67.2 years at birth as a result of COVID. As I said, we are in South Africa had an even larger reduction in the number, but we were the second largest reduction in our life expectancy estimates by UN and also by WHO. Now, first of all, let me tell you about the sheer absurdity of this. We all know that COVID did not impact children. Yeah? So somebody born today would not be affected anything at all till they were about 21 or so. Yeah, because COVID does not really impact anybody below 21, really. Very few cases below that. So in other words, first of all, any reduction here is an assumption that COVID in 20 years' time would still be affecting our life expectancy. So first of all, there is a logical fallacy in reducing anybody's life expectancy based on this. But let that pass. Let us use their own data to see what happens. So it turns out that the basis of this entire thing is the estimation of country-wise excess deaths by WHO, which, as you can see, they have put the number as being something in the range of what is it? It's 4.7 million, from what I can see in the really small. 4.7 million deaths estimated for India, which is by far the largest number of any country in the world. So we asked them, what is the basis of this number? Because this is not the number that our statistical system has come up with. And unless WHO has done its own statistical survey, how did you come up with this? So initially they were humming and hawing, and after a few jabs and pushes, they finally came up with a few media reports by New York Times and Washington Post and a few others. So that is the basis, by the way, of their estimate. Not based on any statistics, but anyway. This is how they came up with that number. But even that number does not justify the reduction. Because, as I said, we are a large country. And, of course, we had a large number of deaths. So, in order to change our life expectancy at birth, you would have to normalize it by the size of the population. You have to make it per capita, per 1,000 people or something like that. So once you normalize it for population size, even with their estimate of deaths, you find that the country-wise total deaths per 1 lakh population for India is one of the lowest. So the question that arises, and you can look to the very last table, you can see that India saw a 3.7-year reduction in life expectancy at birth, which is a 5.2% decline, which is far, far more than what is the case for Germany, Italy, France, UK, US, and so on, all of which have higher death rates from COVID. Right? So even in using their own data, they cannot justify giving us such a large reduction. And yet they did, and they actually have still sticking with it. And that I said, then once you put in a data like this, it begins to infect other things. So this WHO estimate ended up in the UN's estimate of life expectancy, which ends up again in the UN's own HDI index. All based on some New York Times and Washington Post news reports. Just think about it. So in case you had any great respect for much of those statistics, don't have it. Same thing happens with female labor force participation. You'll regularly hear NGOs and the World Bank, etc., ILO come and say that India's female labor force participation is very, very low. Now, India is not perfect, but India actually, if you just look around you, you will see there are lots of women in the workforce anywhere, everywhere in the country. It's certainly true in large cities. Just look at your faculty. Just look at your classmates. But if you also go in the villages, you will see women are working everywhere. Whether it's sowing or harvesting, women are an important part of the workforce. And yet, the ILO estimates India's women labor force participation at 24%. Now, where does this number come from? Well, it turns out India's own official PLFS number is at 32.5. And it is very well known that this 32.5 is actually an underestimate. The head of the ILO's research department, a gentleman called Capsos, himself wrote in 2014 a rather thick paper, which you can read online as well, that India is underestimating its female labor force participation, and that is, the number is above 50. And yet, when he came and took over the department, he not only took India's numbers, rather than adjust it up, he adjusted it down. And again, when we questioned them about their methodology, they refused to share the methodology. I've asked them many, many times. And by the way, I've publicly asked for it because I've written, again, this is a paper, you can read about it, I've written about it in newspapers, I've written about it in working papers, which are also on the ESCPM website, and we have never received a reasonable answer from them. You know, we can keep going. I've given you enough evidence by now to show you both the perception and the supposedly hard data basis for all these indices has got to now be questioned. Who is going about deliberately skewing them? Because I have now gone through many, many indices. If these were honest mistakes, you would think that sometimes they would overestimate, sometimes they will underestimate. And yet, I have yet to come across one international index in which we have a higher ranking than would be expected by any objective criteria. So who is influencing all of this? Well, let's have a look. There are many reasons why this happens. One of them, as I will show you, is the use of inappropriate international benchmarks. There are serious problems with donors and international NGOs influencing our questionnaires and influencing methodology. And of course, there are obsolete questionnaires as well. So it's not merely the case that these things are happening outside India. There is a serious problem with our own statistical systems. And I'm going to now show you what they are. I'm now going to show you the case of anemia. Anemia, many of you may have read that, something like 70% odd of Indians evidently Indian children have evidently got anemia. Something like 57% of women are supposed to have anemia, right? That means this is you would think is a very, very serious issue. And despite one full decade of interventions and giving out iron tablets and folic acid, etc., this number actually has jumped up from 52% of women to 57% of women. So we have become richer, we are presumably eating more, we are becoming evidently obese, but our anemia problem is clearly not going away. Similarly, as I said, almost 70% of our kids are born evidently anemic. How can that possibly be? Well, I also investigated this, and I've also published all of this. It turns out that there is a methodological problem, which is that the way we measure anemia. How do we measure anemia? Well, we do a pinprick, take the blood, and we measure it. But it is very well known worldwide, and there are a large number of studies which have shown that that is the wrong way of taking blood for anemia study. Because when you do that, the blood comes out, it oxidizes, and the amount of hemoglobin measured goes off kilter. The way to measure for anemia, you've got to take intravenous blood. You've got to pull out the blood for one of your veins and then use it. And if you did that, then the number dramatically comes down. A study in UP shows that if corrected just for this problem, then anemia prevalence went from 59.2% to 33% just for the 18 to 49 age group of women, just because of this one correction. Then there is a second correction you need to make. You see, every ethnic group does not have the same level of hemoglobin you want. And it is again very well known in the medical journals that Asian women, normal level of hemoglobin is much lower than is the case for Western women, particularly Northern European women. And this is well established. It's not something, I have come up with. Now, if you adjusted actually for both of these two things, one is the benchmark itself and the way you collect the data, you will discover that for example, under 5 children, the level of anemia goes from 67% as per the NHFS data, which is the normal way of collecting this data, to 15.4%. Now look at the drop that happens just because of a well-known, well-established measurement problem. 67% to 15.4%. But this doesn't mean that it is not a problem. 15.4% of our size of population is still a very large number of people, but it is not 67%. It also means that we shouldn't be going around distributing iron and folic acid and other interventions blindly, because do remember, all of these are chemicals. They're not good for you unless you really need it. So be going around distributing all kinds of medicines based on faulty data is simply dangerous. And in fact plays into the hands of pharmaceutical lobbies which want to sell you more and more drugs. You will certainly notice that every second Indian has diabetes. A new epidemic evidently is happening. Evidently we are all vitamin D deficient. Now in my particular case, how on earth that is possible, I have no idea. I eat non-vegetarian food and I spend a lot of time in the sun. And yet I'm supposedly vitamin D deficient. You've got to be kidding me. So we've now got to begin challenging many of these indicators rather than simply take the data as it comes. And as I've showed you, this data error is not happening by some foreign agency that is coming. It is happening in our own NFHS. That is the main way in which we ourselves collect our data, official data. So why is this happening? Same thing is happening with childhood stunting. NFHS 1921 estimated that something like 35.5% of Indian kids were stunted. In rural areas it was 37.3%, in urban areas it was 30%. Now stunting basically means that the child is essentially shorter than some benchmark, right? That is how stunting is measured. The question then again is, where is that benchmark coming from? It turns out that this benchmark was set many years ago from an extremely small sample of less than 1500 infants worldwide. And the same benchmark was set up by WHO for the whole world without taking into account any ethnic differences, from samples taken from some 5-6 countries. Now who are those countries? Norway, US, Brazil, Cameroon. No, it was Ghana, sorry, Ghana. It also interestingly included India. And where did they do the survey in India? Well, they did it in and around defense colony. Why did they do it? It was the reasonable thing to do. You went to the locality where you had the best fed, best medicated kids. And presumably that set the benchmark for that if Indian children had good food, nutrition, medical care, what would their height be? And remember, these are the tallest kids in the country because they're also ethnically Punjabi mostly. Yeah, this is death call of 20 years ago. So these are the tallest kids in the country, and yet in that survey they were the shortest kids. Now you cannot make the case that Punjabi kids getting more than adequate food and medical supply in defense colony are somehow stunted. They're not. Somebody may claim that they're obese, maybe I would still accept it. But stunted? You've got to be kidding me. What is the problem? The problem is the benchmark. You've created a benchmark which is actually an impossibility for any Indians. I mean, Eastern India would never be able to stand up to this benchmark. And yet we are using this ourselves as the benchmark, causing all kinds of stress to young parents, forcing overfeeding, and then later on being told we are obese. So why is the NFHS our own data collection system repeatedly giving these odd results? Why are we using these strange, clearly outdated, wrong global benchmarks? So I actually went and opened up the questionnaire and began to investigate the matter and found something very, very interesting. Now NFHS is our National Family and Health Survey, so it presumably asks questions about health. And there is, not surprisingly, a page on malaria, which is an important disease. So here are the questions that were asked on the malaria page. Now you would think that on the malaria page the questions that you would be asking would be relating to, did some of your kids or somebody in your family get malaria in recent times? Maybe questions about, are there lots of mosquitoes? Do you use, you may even ask, do you use mosquito net or Odomos or whatever it is? No. There were no questions to that effect. The questions were very, very peculiar. They were all about the brand of mosquito nets that were being used. And here are the questions. These are live questions, you can go and look them up. So the respondents were asked, which mosquito net do you use? And then they were given a long list of mosquito nets. Dava Plus, Dura Net, Interceptor, Life Net, Magnet, Net Protect, Oliset, Permanet, Royal Sentry, Eurocool, and it turns out that all of these, by the way, are Chinese brands. First of all, I doubt anybody in this audience has any idea if they use mosquito nets, what brand of mosquito nets they use. And even if they did, why would you be only surveying this for Chinese mosquito net brands? It turns out, and we investigated this further, and we then found something very interesting. You see, these were these questions because these are the brands that a group of NGOs, foreign NGOs, which included USAID, were distributing in the country. And what they were trying to do using our official survey was to find out how much of these nets were getting used after their distribution and what was their recall value. Now this is something clearly of use to foreign NGOs. Question is, why was our official data collection system being used to get information that is of use to foreign NGOs? Well, it turns out because the foreign NGOs were setting the questions. Our investigation found that UNICEF and USAID, under the guise of technical collaboration, have been setting our NFHS questions from the very beginning. And these are not therefore questions that are of any particular interest to us. So they don't actually care. In fact, it is of benefit to them for their donor stories to actually deliberately show India worse so that they can ask for more monies and so on, presumably, I don't know. And so what they do is they pad the whole questionnaire up with all kinds of irrelevant and outdated questions and then insert the ones that are of use to them. And those are the ones that get surveyed in NFHS. So those of you using NFHS data, this is what you are actually made to use. This is what our national health policy is being used on. And here is more evidence of this. Part of the padding is putting all kinds of irrelevant questions in there just to show that we are being comprehensive. Here is the questions on trying to gauge the socio-economic background of the respondent. Look at the questions they are asked. They are asked whether they own a black and white television. Remember this 2019-22 survey. This is not some ancient survey. This is the survey of just a few years ago. They are being asked whether they own a radio transistor, black and white television. Is there anyone in this room who owns a black and white television? Do any of you own a transistor? I'm sorry, according to this indicators, you are all socio-economically extremely deprived population. And if you thought all of this was bad enough, all of this data, perception and hard data generated through this peculiar mechanism is now getting hardwired into a new bunch of norms called the environmental, social and governance indicators or norms. In 2006, in a very innocuous paper published by the UN, the idea of having ESG norms was mooted. Now, in theory, why should anybody have a problem with having environmental, social and governance norms? After all, this sounds like a good thing. So everybody by that said, yes, it's a good idea. Nobody opposed it. How could they? But interestingly, that paper never defined what these norms, ESG norms, would be. And so what happened very slyly over the next decade or so, a small group of NGOs, by the way, the same NGOs I have discovered all this while, came up without asking anyone. There was no consultation with anyone around the world. They came up with a bunch of parameters. And slowly but steadily, these parameters have got naturalized into investment activity, into foreign trade, into regulation, into corporate balance sheets are now expected to comply with ESG norms. But there has never been any discussion on what these ESG norms are. Who came up with them? Who is supposed to monitor them? Who is supposed to certify them? So I and my team did a full research of who is the sort of driving force of all of these indicators, norms, etc. worldwide. And we discovered a whole bunch of institutions that are doing this kind of research, setting norms and slowly but steadily being accepted by governments around the world. not just in Europe and the West, but even our own ones across the country, Africa, everywhere. These are the same set of institutions that set the norms, provide the certification, and basically tell you are a good boy, you are a bad boy, and so on. And of course, all done for a fee. But what I found most interesting is that every one of those institutions, behind them was essentially three funding institutions were behind every single one of them. USAID, Ford Foundation, and Soros's Open Society. Effectively, what is happening is that the world is ending up getting run by rules that nobody has discussed with anyone, but which, after a little bit of digging, you discover come from these same three institutions. So these three institutions, i.e., three institutions based in the North Atlantic, decide effectively if you are a good boy or a bad boy, and will issue you a certificate. This is a form of neo-colonial control, and a very insidious one that you should be aware of. Now you may think that I am really suspicious character with all kinds of conspiracy theories in my head, and that I have some irrational fear of international NGOs. So now let me illustrate to you things that you should be aware of, so that you know that this is not a new thing. The scale of this and the extent to which India is being targeted by this effort may be unprecedented, but India being targeted by international NGOs, international agencies, funding agencies, international organizations is not a new thing. This has been going on for decades. I'm just going to give you one illustration of how this has been going on for decades. Now you all know of a major problem in India over the last several decades, which is of gender selection through abortion at birth, right? You're all aware of this? Yeah? Now where did this come from? Now, we'll all be told, oh, it's because Indians are bad and there's patriarchy. Yeah, that's why you'll be told. But you will be surprised to know that systematic gender selection through abortions was actually promoted in India in the 1970s and 80s by these same international organizations. I'm not making this up. Read about it in this book written by a Pulitzer-winning writer, Mara Heusenthal. It's called Unnatural Selection, where you will hear what happened. Essentially what happened is in the 1950s to the 70s, there was a big fear in the West that very high rates of population growth in the global South would mean that their population would eventually get overrun. So they decided that they had to do something about it, and they decided that India and China were particular countries where they should try and do something about it. So they decided that, look, why don't we take something that already exists? There was already son preference for sons. Let's take this and weaponize it. Because in the end, the population growth rate of a country, the reproductive capability of a country only depends on women there are. Doesn't matter how many men you have, depends on how many women you have. So what we can do is we can weaponize this by encouraging gender-selected abortions, so that effectively the number of women dramatically shrinks, and therefore population growth suddenly comes to a crashing halt. So in 1969, basically in 1969, the Population Council sent somebody called Sheldon Segar to India. So he was head of the biomedical division of the Population Council in the US to India. And he sat down with B.L. Vaina, who was the director of India's family planning. And then they began to carry out sex selection abortion using a new technology at that time called ultrasound. So it was with funding from Rockefeller and UN agencies and Ford Foundation that the very first group of ultrasounds were imported into India. And the first few thousand sex selection abortions in the 1970s was done in AIIMS. Many of those who did those operations are still alive. And you can read about them in this book, Unnatural Selection. So just imagine what we are today beaten up about by the same NGOs was actually encouraged by them. And then, of course, once it was successful in AIIMS, they put it on in car. They got into their cars and they drove out into the neighboring districts on highways extending out of Lodi Road. And even today, the worst skews in gender are there on those districts in Haryana, Punjab and Western UP, which were on those highways leading out of Delhi in the 1970s and 80s. So just imagine how social engineering was carried out on us with full backing and knowledge of our government, because we did not see what they were doing. And of course, we talked about emergency, you know what happened in that emergency as well. So a large social experiment was carried out on us. This also, by the way, happened even more successfully through the one-child policy in China. Here are some of the quotes that I have taken from the book. Western money had backed the creation of an extensive network of community family planning advisors in India, and an amniocentesis spread from AIIMS to other government hospitals. These advisors encouraged women to go for a test, which the hospitals provided. In the story told by the documents, so all the documents, and this is fully documented, of International Planned Parenthood Federation and Rockefeller Foundation, the AIIMS experiment can trace itself back to the West. Western organizations unveiled measures aimed at the lower classes, so they were deliberately aiming this at the lower class, the poorer section. Bankrolled sterilization campaign that paid men in famine-stricken areas to undergo vasectomies. So this is the origin of certain rice bag behaviors. In 1975, AIIMS presented research that advanced sex selection, abortion as a means to population control, and there are reports of doctors encouraging pregnant patients to abort female fetuses because population control was deemed so urgent. All of this was done by the same agencies that now lecture us on gender and all these kinds of issues. So the question is, now that you've heard the long story, what needs to be done? First thing we need to do is to understand that this is an issue. I hope I managed to convince you that this is a serious issue. Need to pay attention to this. Your generation will need to pay attention to this. Because once the narrative has been set, once the rules have been set, you will have to play in those rules. So it is very important that you question those rules now. We need to release quality and timely domestic data. We need to improve our own domestic systems, get rid of so-called international collaboration. We need to take control of it ourselves. Many of these surveys are not rocket science. We are quite capable of doing it. If we can send satellites to Mars and the Moon, we can certainly do NFHS surveys on our own. We've got to take control of it. We need to do capacity building. We have an opportunity, interestingly, to use the 4 years membership of the UN Statistical Commission, which we have just joined. This is important because this is not a problem that is unique to India. This is now actually done widely across the global south to manipulate us in multiple ways. We need to take it up with international organizations like World Bank. As I told you, World Bank is particularly active in collating many of these indices, whitewashing them, giving them a stamp of legitimacy, and effectively creating a conduit for it to be further used into things like sovereign ratings. But in the end, we need to begin to turn the gaze. By this I mean, we Indians now, if we are going to be the world's third largest economy, surely we have a right to rank the rest of the world. We need to create sovereign ratings for the rest of the world. Indian NGOs, think tanks, departments need to create democracy index, freedom index, all kinds of indices, and rate the rest of the world. We have to have the confidence to do this. I'm not saying we should lie. I'm not saying that you should give India a free pass. On things we need to improve, we should. But we need to create objective ways of thinking about the world from our own viewpoint. And that is absolutely critical. And that is something that my generation will hopefully initiate, but it's something that your generation will really have to do. The first step towards this is already on its way. Before the end of this year, an Indian agency called Care Edge, India's second largest rating agency, it's also Indian owned, which was important, will be publishing sovereign ratings for 40 countries. And by April, May of next year, it will be doing 100 countries. So for the first time, a rating agency from the global south will be doing sovereign ratings for the rest of the world. And we'll be making it freely available to whoever wants to use it. Similarly, there are some think tanks which will be coming out very soon with their own democracy index and other indices. So first time Indian think tanks will be having the confidence to do this. Go ahead, question their methodology, question what they are doing, help us refine these things. Maybe I'm quite confident that we will, after a few iterations, create methodologies and rankings which will be absolutely rock solid and the world's best. And then we can deal with the rest of the world. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to answer questions if you want.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a pleasure to hear all your views and ideas. We can take up questions from the audience now.
We'll take about 3 questions. Is that good? Yeah.
So my question is, my name is Hemant. My question is, one of the very important rating is credit rating for our country, which is very low. We have very low credit rating, and that is affected by very Western countries. So that for growth story of India, India is growing country, we need huge investment for our sustainable growth. So how India tackle that situation that Western countries are affecting that credit rating, so the India get loan at a very higher rate of interest.
So you're asking, the main question is, why is India's rating where it is? And you're absolutely right to question this, because while India is an investment grade rated country, it's at the lowest level of the investment grade. We are BBB minus country on the S&P scale. And similar rating for Fitch and Moody's as well. Now this makes no sense. We are less indebted than most of the Western countries that are AAA, AA, single A, etc. Unlike any of them during the COVID crisis, we did not go and blow up our fiscal and monetary levers. Our economy is growing faster. It's the fastest growing major economy in the world. Every indicator you want, our financial system is better capitalized and better positioned than any of their financial systems. And yet we are at the bottom. In fact, Greece, which went bust just a few years ago, is also at the same level as us. So it is very clear that India's sovereign rating is unduly low. My own estimate is that if it was fairly done, we would end up with a BBB plus, which is 2 ranks up from where we are today. I'm not saying that we will be a AAA country or something. There are problems with the Indian economy, but if you did a fair ranking of India, my estimate is that we would end up with 2 notches upgrade from where we are to about BBB plus. But there, even in the sovereign ratings, as I pointed out to you, one of the major categories that pulls down our ranking is this 20% weightage that is given to all these soft factors, these perception indices. And because nobody questions these perception indices, they continue to do whatever they do. So even as our economic and the objective indicators keep improving, VDM and company rankings keep deteriorating. And I showed them to you. Now those high maths supercomputer generated numbers keep undoing the fact that our economic indicators are just simply vastly superior to our peers at our sovereign rating level. But that is why we need to begin questioning these things. For so far too long, we just went along with whatever the rest of the world did. But as I said, the time has come to begin to question them. So one of the reasons I've come to talk to institutions like yourself is in order to get people to begin to think about these things and be confident to begin questioning them. Yeah, second question.
Very good morning, sir. My name is Aditya Somasundar from the first year batch at BB. So my question is, we talked quite a lot about ESG, and ESG has made its way through deep into companies and countries. So what I'd like to know is your 2 cents on, is the timing quite convenient, because India is on its way to becoming the 3rd largest economy in dollar terms, as you say, and is the 3rd largest purchasing power country. So is the timing quite convenient, as in that the developed nations have already exhausted their resources, their part of nature during their development phase, and now countries like India, China, and some other developing countries are in that phase currently. This tool of ESG, if the term.
So first of all, I have personally no problem with having some environmental, social, and governance norms. Right? That is not my problem, and that is not the debate I am here to debate. My contention is, who decides what these ESG norms are? Who then monitors them? Who certifies them? And what has happened is that as these ESG norms have grown everywhere, the funny thing is that they have been set without any wider discussion by a tiny group of people based in the North Atlantic. And as I showed you, all of them, there are just 3 institutions that have funded all the institutions that have come up with these norms. Essentially, they are the opinions of 3 institutions. Who gave them this right? So for the discussion today, my thing is that, look, we need to ask these questions. Who is this person who's decided? By the way, I'm not the only person questioning it. Even in the West, people are questioning this. So you have the absurd situation where the highest ESG ranked companies of the West are all cigarette companies. And Tesla, which is supposedly into electrical cars, etc., is ranked actually rather low. It's a mid-level ranking. How have they done this? Well, by basically massaging this in various ways, and it's quite clear that you can pay for getting a higher ESG ranking. So this is clearly not a fair system. So personally, I have no problem with having environmental laws. My problem is who decided what these norms are and why should we accept them? So I'm just bringing up this issue that, look, if there has to be ESG norms which are applicable and which countries like the European Union are now trying to apply, everybody, not just within their country, but even outside, the people who they trade with and all that, we need to have a question about this. And just to give you an example, there is a big thing in one of the ways these things are being applied is, for example, the European Union, to help the environment, all steel imports into the European Union must be made from green steel. And it's not just the steel, but even things made from steel. So if a car is sent to the Europeans, it has to be made from steel that is green. So the question is, how do you define green? It turns out that it's defined in a very peculiar way, such that the Germans own all the patents. Yeah, and effectively you have to pay them in order to produce the steel in a peculiar way so that you can export to them. Now this is again, as I said, it's something between a non-tariff barrier and a form of neo-colonialism. Yeah? Yes, in the back.
Amita Gupta, I am from biochemistry. So I'm not from economics, but thank you very much for a very illuminating and thought-provoking lecture. Because we work on infectious diseases, developing new drugs, new diagnostics. But today I need to think about, the data that is coming for our country, for the disease burden. I work on tuberculosis, and despite tremendous effort being made for tackling the disease, it's always India with the highest disease burden, the highest mortality rate, the highest TB drug resistance data, and it is not changing, it is only increasing despite what we feel is not the real scenario. So today,
So please
with
look at
your
this data.
Yes, today with your lecture, I really think that that's another aspect that we need to start working on, to evaluate whether the WHO data and the data that is coming for the disease burden for our country, is it really true or not? Thank you.
Please have a look at it, and if you find something interesting, please bring it to me, and I will publicize it and add it to my presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
This will have to be the last question because I have to go somewhere after this.
Good morning, sir. So I am Zishan from the first year batch. My question is, sir, if we talk about George Soros, he has invested his own $36 billion into Open Society Foundation. He's a billionaire. He's a huge stock market billionaire, and he's known for crashing the stock market of London, Japan, and all. So, and if we trace back his roots, he is from the Jewish ethnicity. He has suffered the Jewish Holocaust. So, what are their motives? These people, like Soros Foundation, Ford Foundation, what are their motives to downgrading India's?
Well, very simple. I mean, they want to control societies, and for the same reason that the East India Company wanted to control them, because effectively they want to control you in order to be able to extract rent in various ways, so that, you know, the rise of rivals like India, which they may not be able to control, they find that threatening. There's nothing very new in this, by the way. This has been going on from the beginning of time. The problem is that in the past they would have occupied your country, shot a lot of people, you know, and imposed more direct control. Today that is not quite possible to do, and certainly not possible to do with a country like us. So other means of control are used. This, I gave you a short sort of outlook of one set of things in which this control is exercised. There are many other ways. I mean, for example, social media and how it is utilized. After it was taken over by Elon Musk, you may have seen how he put out all the internal conversations of that organization. And you could see that they were deliberately skewing the conversation and massaging it in a particular way in order to influence conversations around the world. So clearly this kind of thing was going on. There has also been TikTok, which we have banned in India, and I don't know if you've been watching in the last 1 week, how TikTok is being used, and you can guess who is using it, but it's being used to normalize the idea that the attacks of 9/11 in New York were actually justified, and Osama bin Laden's letter to the Americans is being widely read by young people in America, using TikTok as the medium to popularize doing it. Just imagine, America in 2023, where, you know, just 2 decades after the Twin Towers were brought down. So it's not some long history back. People who witnessed the Twin Towers being brought down are still around. And in that world, they are using TikTok to normalize the idea that the attacks on the Twin Towers was a justified activity. In America, I'm not talking about somewhere in the Arab world or some other place. In America, this idea is being normalized. And TikTok is being used to do it. Right? And you can Google up and see how this is. So I'm showing you how warfare happens in many various ways. The eventual invasion usually is the last step. And as a country that has been occupied repeatedly by foreign invaders who have then sucked us dry, we need to be absolutely wary of how all of this is done. And this will happen in multiple ways. I mean, I don't have the time right now, but as somebody who was the principal economic advisor to the government during the COVID period, I have lots of interesting stories to tell about how vaccines, for example, foreign vaccines were being imposed on us, how pharmaceutical companies tried to do all kinds of things to subvert our own indigenous efforts on vaccination, how we were deliberately given wrong economic advice repeatedly to try and trip us. we had to dodge so many bullets along the way. And so, the fact that we are standing today as probably the strongest economy in the world right now has happened because of a lot of effort that has been done by policymakers of my generation. And one of the things we are trying to do in this outreach is to let you know these stories so that you are better armed in not too distant future, and it will happen faster than you think. You will be running this ship. So you should know how to think about these issues.
Thank you, sir, for answering all our queries. On behalf of the Department of Finance and Business Economics, I would like to take this opportunity to extend a vote of thanks to our guests, Professor Prakash Singh, sir, and Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, sir. Your insights left an indelible mark on all of us, igniting contemplation and enthusiasm within the audience. It was truly an honor. I would also like to extend our gratitude to our former founding faculty members, respected Professor Nair and Professor Prasad. I also want to thank Professor Ananya Ghosh Dassidar ma'am, Dr. C.M. Negi sir, Dr. Aprasanna ma'am for their initiative. We would also extend a heartiest thanks to Professor Yamini Gupta ma'am, Dr. Sunil Kumar sir, Dr. Sonal Chupral ma'am, and all the other faculty members and professors. I also want to thank the audience for engaging with the session. Now, the Department of Finance and Business Economics would like to present a small token of appreciation to our esteemed speaker. Thank you, Sanjeev sir. With this, we come to the conclusion of this session, and I now request everyone to please proceed